Hi, I'm James Hamilton from Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal, and this month's Cool Tools video focuses on digital tools. These have become very popular in the last few years, and it took me a while to get into them, mostly because I doubted that a machinist level of precision was truly useful for woodworking. But a couple of years back, I started collecting them and putting them to use, and I learned that it isn't just about ultra accuracy. It's also about repeatability and eliminating errors. You'll see what I mean as I show you 10 tools that I use in my shop. We're going to be moving quickly, so be sure to check out the links in the notes below this video if you want more information, or if you want to skip ahead in this video to a particular tool. Just click on Show More below. We'll be dividing them into categories. We'll have depth gauges, angle gauges, and calipers and compasses. You may be surprised what's out there and what you can do with them. So let's get started. My first digital tool was a depth gauge. They've been around for quite a while and they're really useful. I have 3 types and I like each one for a different reason. This one is called the Snap Check. I assume it gets its name from the snapping sound it makes when the embedded magnets attach to a cast iron tool top, such as my jointer. I like the way it stays firmly in place without having to hold it with my hand as I adjust the height of my outfeed table. This is a crucial setting, and the magnets on this gauge make it easier and more accurate in my opinion. I also use it on my table saw to set the blade height. Where this really comes in handy though is to record and repeat settings. For example, at the router table, a tiny change in a bit's height can change the profile of a cut. If I have to go back and recut that exact same profile, I have to make sure I get the height dead on. So I use the gauge to measure the bit's height, then I record those settings, and later if I need to, I can go back to them and get that bit in the exact same position. It's been a lifesaver more than once, I can tell you. Another form of depth gauge I have is the 2-legged sort. This one doesn't have the magnets on the base, but it has a couple of advantages over the last one. I find it's a little more convenient to use on the base of a router to set the plunge depth, especially if it's a small base. But the biggest benefit of this gauge is its greater range of motion. I can use it with a table saw blade that's raised higher above the table, and it will reach deeper below the surface for measuring mortises, for example. This one is also a favorite of welders who use it to check the thickness of their welds for consistency. Another digital depth gauge that I use is this little guy. I bought this a couple of years ago when it first came out because I saw someone doing something really interesting with one. He used it to set the depth of a hand plane iron. Now I wasn't trying to achieve a specific shaving thickness. What he was doing was making it faster and easier to set the plane up after he removed the iron for sharpening. Whenever you remove and replace the iron, you have to reset the depth, and that's usually done by trial and error. With this gauge, I can measure the depth of my iron, remove it for sharpening, and then quickly return it to the exact same position. I know some of you hand tool users out there will scoff at the idea of applying digital technology to a traditional tool, but I was surprised how effective it is. Out of all the digital tools in this video, if you only owned one, it should be an angle gauge, specifically one of these little blocks. This is called the Smart Angle Cube. I also have a Wixie, which is another popular brand, but I like this one better because it has a bigger, brighter display that's easier to read, especially in lower light. And it has an internal battery that recharges with a USB cable. One of my biggest complaints about digital tools is those big watch-type batteries always seem to be dead when you need the tool. This one lasts longer and it charges up quickly, so that solves a big problem in my opinion. The way these work is simple, but really effective. I use it most often on the table saw. I set it on the top and zero it out. That accounts for the floor under the saw, which may not be level. Now I stick the magnetic base on the side of my saw blade, and it'll tell me if my blade is perfectly perpendicular to the table. If you have poor eyesight or low light, this will be easier and more accurate than a machinist square. I can also use it to set any precise bevel angle I need, and return it back to 90 degrees when I'm finished. I use it on my bandsaw too, to set the table angle for special cuts, or to just check the blade setup before resawing. In fact, it can be used in all sorts of instances, wherever you need to measure an angle. This particular angle cube also has Bluetooth built in. I don't find that to be particularly useful myself, but some folks like to use various apps on their smartphones to collect and record data. It seems like they're putting Bluetooth in everything nowadays. I also have a larger version. This is called a 360 digital level, and as you would expect, it's closer to the size of a small torpedo level. I use this for installing cabinets or working with larger home improvement projects. The cube is tough, but this one is heavier and it has more metal. The box says it's military grade alloy and it'll take a beating, which is important for something that you're going to be taking to a job site. This one's also rechargeable. It's available with Bluetooth and it has a giant bright display. If I had to choose between the angle cube and the digital level, I choose the cube. But if I did a lot of cabinets and carpentry, I'd want the level too. Another digital angle gauge I use in my shop is Protractors. I actually have two of them, which I use for different purposes. The first is really a square. I like this one because it's really heavy duty. The steel is over 1/8 of an inch thick, heavier than any of my machinist squares. I set it to any angle and I can use the big knob to lock it down. It's firm, but it would still move if I bump it against a bench top, so I keep an eye on it. But the digital display will tell me if it's moved at all, so I find it to be extremely accurate. I use it for layout and to measure some angles too. The other version I like is a digital protractor. This is a little lighter than the square, but it's still really durable. I like it because I can use it as a bevel square to measure and transfer an angle to my table saw blade. I've seen these expensive bevel gauge setup blocks out there for setting accurate angles on traditional squares, but this is just as accurate and the whole thing was like 20 bucks. Now, if I had to choose between one of these, I'd probably choose the square because it can also be used to measure angles, and then I can use that little cube to set my saw blade accordingly. That's why digital tools are so nice. You can carry one setting between various tools very precisely. I use calipers all the time to measure the outer diameter of a bearing for a jig or to measure a router bit before cutting a dado. I don't have to tell you why calipers are so handy. I just have to say that I prefer digital calipers because they're easier for me to read, especially if they display fractions rather than just decimals. Some of the cheaper calipers out there can lose accuracy if you move them too quickly. The sensor on this one doesn't have that problem at all. And it's Bluetooth enabled, if you're into that. One unique way I use my calipers is in conjunction with this digital marking gauge. I use the calipers to measure the thickness of a workpiece, then I transfer that number to the marking gauge for a precise setup. Of course, you don't have to have the calipers to use the marking gauge. Instead, you could just sit the gauge on top of your workpiece and drop the round cutter down onto the bench top, or you could use the display alone to set a specific measurement. Like that hand plane setup tool we talked about earlier, this one brings modern technology to traditional hand tool work. I think it's pretty cool. And it's well made too. This is a serious piece of thick machined steel. I have a set of outside calipers that I use for turning. These spread up to 6 inches and they're spring loaded, so they're very comfortable to work with. If you need precise measurements on the lathe, such as for reproducing spindles, these are definitely worth a look. I've seen various versions for measuring the inside of a turning, but I find that the outside ones are the most useful for the small amount of turning I do. Another thing I've gotten a lot of use out of is this digital compass. It is so much easier to set precisely, in my opinion. You just touch the two tips together and zero it out. Then you can set it to anything you like and it'll be dead on. There are different tips that come with it, including pencil leads, and you can also use it as a divider for layout tasks, but I use it most often for circles. So these are some of the digital tools that I use in my shop. Some I use all the time, others just once in a while for specific projects or tasks. If I had to point out some flaws that are inherent with any digital tool, I'd say it has to be battery life. Not that batteries die quickly. All tools I have an auto shut-off feature to preserve battery life. That's important. Make sure your tools have that. But time flies. You put a tool in a drawer, and suddenly it's a year later, and you pull it out and the battery's dead. So I keep extra batteries around, and thankfully all my tools take the same batteries. In the package, the extra batteries don't lose power like they can in the tool. In fact, if you aren't going to use a tool for a long time, you may even just remove the battery. Another downside of digital tools used to be the cost. They were really expensive at one time. But I've been using the eye gauging ones for a couple of years now, and I found them to be both surprisingly inexpensive and durable. All the tools I showed you are around $35 or less, most around 20 bucks. And again, they're all really well made. I'll put links to them in the notes below this video. Well, that does it for this edition of Cool Tools. Be sure to check out the latest issue of Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal. It's always full of great woodworking tips, tricks, and tutorials designed to make you a better woodworker. You can read and subscribe for free at stumpynubs.com. See you there.